Welcome. My name is Stacy Holmes. I'm with the BitFocus King County System Administration team for the HMIS team here. We will do some introductions. Just so you know, in the room, we were expecting to have around 35 to 40 people, and then online we had about 80 registered. We have less right now in the room, and we have less online, but we have about 43 right now, and we're seeing that number climb. So that's what happens. We try to offer both in person and online, and because something is different, works different for everyone. And if you haven't attended one of these dual audience sessions before, just know that we will be trying to read questions from our online audience. We will be trying to make sure they can hear us. So that means we'll be repeating questions a lot if you have questions from the back of the room. And we'll do our best to address any technical issues. So as a start, I've already introduced myself. I'll let the other BitFocus team introduce themselves, and then we can go around the room and have our in-person audience introduce themselves.
I'm Sarah Doherty. I lead the HMIS System Administration team for BitFocus.
I'm Danielle Robide. I'm new on the System Administration team for BitFocus.
Do you want to start?
I'm Shanti. I work for the YWCA as a residential life coach.
And I'm Crystal, and I also work for the YWCA as a residential life coach.
I'm Randall, and I work at Compass Housing Alliance as their data analyst.
I'm Anna Whitney from Harborview Housing First.
I'm Mary Dunbar. I'm with Kids Plus through Seattle King County Public Health, and I'm a social worker.
I'm Madeline. I work with Solid Ground here.
I'm Arthur Wormus. I work for Low Income Housing Institute.
I'm Dixon McQuillan, King County Homeless Program.
Kate Spells, King County Homeless Housing Program. Irene Denham, City of Seattle Human Services Department.
Great, thank you. So I know that from the online audience, they cannot hear, they had a hard time hearing you guys, and they cannot hear folks in the audience. And that, you know, for the introductions, we're not repeating all of them, but we're doing our best. We are recording this, so we are, you'll hear me asking folks to speak up or bellowing at you, mostly so that the sound is good. Sarah might be bellowing so that the sound is good for the recording as well. And then folks online, we'll do our best to repeat everything, to get your questions answered, and anything that we can't get to today, we will follow up because we have a chat log and we can follow up directly. Oh, and I was going to say, sorry, I do have a list of all the 80 people who registered for the online, and just so you know, so that you know who is with you at this training. I'm not going to repeat everybody, but know that we had about 31 organizations represented. That included lots of shelter providers, homeless service providers, housers, funders, so a variety, a wide swath of participating agencies that are joining you at this training, but in the online audience.
Thank you, Stacey. Okay, yes, I'll stand up just so that I project appropriately for our online audience. Okay, so this is our training on HMIS and chronic homelessness. We're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of chronic homelessness with regard to HMIS, and hopefully we cover it all. Feel free to ask questions as you have them, or you can save them to the end when we'll have time for questions as well. So let's start with the basics. The HUD definition of chronic homelessness. I am certain that you guys are familiar with this, but it gives us a good foundation. So the HUD definition is a homeless individual or head of household with a disabling condition who's been continuously homeless for a year or more, or a homeless individual or head of household with a disabling condition who has had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. Yeah, I guess I
can't hear you, so yeah, right. That's fine.
The role of HMIS in chronic homeless documentation. So we collect a lot of information in HMIS that can be used to make determinations about chronic homeless status. The first piece I'm going to talk about is the client self-reported data. This data is the stuff that's collected when you enroll somebody in HMIS. These are the living situation questions, the questions about disability. They are used in the system to make determinations about chronic homelessness on certain HUD reports and in other places in the system. Obviously, these are not the pieces that you use when documenting chronic homelessness for the purpose of program eligibility. But it's a little bit confusing. And so I want to make sure that we go through the pieces and how they're used and not used so that folks understand. So we're going to start with the disability question. Excuse me. There are two questions or two sets of questions that make a determination in the system of whether somebody can be determined to be chronically homeless with regard to disability. The first one is disabling condition equals yes. So when you're enrolling somebody in a program, you see all these questions. You see the disabling condition question, and then you see a series of questions that identify specific kinds of disabling conditions that an individual might have. In order to count somebody as chronically homeless in the system, you either have to say yes to disabling condition, or you could have to say yes to one of the specific conditions and indicate that it is a long-term condition. I know that these questions seem like they actually kind of contradict each other. Like, wouldn't you say yes to both of them if you, I mean, that's what occurs to me anyway. But HUD does make us account them separately. And so I imagine that it's so that you can account for disabling conditions that aren't listed down below and still be able to, capture that information. Arthur?
When I'm running a data quality report, I'm actually noticing that if there is a yes under a specific disability, but there's a no there, it pops up as an error.
Oh, okay. So that makes sense. So Arthur was just saying that that he notices when he runs a data quality report that if you have conflicting information there, it pops up as an error, which that also makes sense to me, that you should be indicating that that there is a disabling condition as well as a specific type of condition. I guess I don't know why HUD makes us ask both, but they do. So
From my perspective, it's good because clients often will say no to the disabling condition, but then they do identify having a mental health problem or substance abuse, so they don't see themselves as disabled.
Right.
They do endorse mental health condition or
right.
other.
In that instance, though, that's where it results in the error report in the data quality report. So it makes sense to mark, in that case, then go back and mark disabling condition as yes. But if they mark yes on disabling condition and no on all the other ones, that doesn't register as an error in the data quality report. So yeah.
So should we be telling people that, hey, if they do identify these things, hey, you have a disabling condition?
Yeah, so the conversation that's happening in the room is around disabling condition versus one of the more specific disabling conditions, and how some clients don't necessarily identify themselves as having a disabling condition, but will say yes to one of the more specific conditions, not necessarily equating the two. But because a disparity between the two does pop up as a data quality error, even if a client says no to the first one and yes to one of the following ones, you should probably go back and change the disabling condition option to yes, so that you're not getting, excuse me, so that you're not getting that data quality error. I didn't expect such a long conversation on this one. That's good. That's good.
That's good.
Okay. So
moving. I don't know if we missed, thank you, Kate. I don't know if we missed anybody, but there's a sign-up sheet for when you leave, if you haven't signed in, and there are handouts here if you haven't captured it.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm in the right place.
The HMIS and chronic homelessness?
No.
Okay. Okay. So now we're getting to the actually complicated part of this client self-reported information, which is the living situation. There are lots of different questions that will show up depending on different circumstances and how you answer the very first question. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the options and why different things show up when. By default, you see the first two questions: the type of residence immediately prior to program enrollment and length of stay in prior living situation. The second question, length of stay, you would think that would be a useful question in determining chronic homelessness. However, that is actually not used at all by HUD in determining chronic homelessness. That they use it in other situations to kind of cross-check some of the other answers to make sure that there's integrity to some of the other answers, but they don't actually use it at all in the actual calculation of determining of when HUD determines whether folks are chronically homeless, like in the AHAR or the APR, for example. So you have to answer it, but know that it's not contributing to the chronic homeless determination for a client. But the first one, the type of residence immediately prior to program enrollment, that one does trigger many other pieces of information that HUD may or may not want to collect to make that determination about whether somebody's chronically homeless. For example, if you choose that somebody's prior residence was an institution, in this case, we've selected hospital or other residential non-psychiatric medical facility. The system wants to make sure that the person still can be considered chronically homeless. So you get prompted with subsequent questions, whether the length of stay was less than 90 days on the night before, whether they stayed on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven. And that's because, as we know, the HUD definition allows for folks to maintain their chronic homeless status if they are coming from an institution, so long as the stay was less than 90 days and they were homeless immediately prior to that institutional stay. So the system asks you these questions. If you answer no to either one of them, the client is determined to not be chronically homeless and you don't get any additional questions. Another prior living situation that will prompt additional questions is if you indicate that the client was housed immediately in their immediately prior to program enrollment residence. If you say that they're housed, then you have to answer a follow-up question of whether the length of stay was less than 7 days, because if the length of stay is less than 7 days, they can potentially maintain their chronic homeless status even if they're coming from a house situation. If it's not less than 7 days, then they are no longer able to be calculated as chronically homeless in this context. They may actually still be chronically homeless depending on their full homelessness history, but for this purpose, HUD tells them no. So that's another question that you may see depending on your type of residence immediately prior to program enrollment. So at this point, if nothing has prevented this client from being counted as chronically homeless, if they were coming from an institution, but it was less than 90 days and they were homeless immediately prior, if they were coming from a house situation, but the stay was less than 7 days, or if they were actually coming from homelessness, then you get to the questions that actually determine, that HUD actually uses to determine whether a client is chronically homeless, which are these last three that show up here. The bottom three: approximate date homelessness started, number of times on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years, and total number of months homeless on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years. So these are the actual questions that HUD uses to make the final determination about whether somebody is chronically homeless. Those other questions were kind of screen out questions, and these are the screen in questions. So the first question, approximate date homelessness started. If you answer with a date that's more than a year ago, they get counted as chronically homeless. If you don't answer with a date of more than a year ago, then you go on to the next question. They all show up there, but HUD uses the calculation differently, but you still have to answer all of them.
If a client has not been homeless for a year consecutively, you then need to take a look at the number of times that client has been homeless in the last 3 years. So if a client has not been homeless for a consecutive year, but has been homeless 4 or more times in the last 3 years, and those 4 episodes of homelessness equal 12 months or more, then that client can also be considered chronically homeless as long as that individual has a disabling condition.
Is there a way in the HMIS system, if you are into a client, that you would see that they are chronically homeless? Is there like a identifier saying that they're chronically homeless, or do you have to look up their history?
So there's a question about whether there's a way in the system to determine, to see if somebody is marked as chronically homeless or identified by the system as chronically homeless. There's a report that you can use. It's called the client summary report, which will actually show you later on. There's not anything just directly on the screen that you can look at, but the report's pretty easy to get to, and it's just a client by client report. So
we have a couple questions here as
Okay.
well. So one question is, how aware is HUD that many clients can't remember the answers to these questions?
I am sure that HUD is very aware of that, but they have chosen to count these answers as they do. So, I mean, I'm certain that they get that feedback all the time. Unfortunately, we just have to work with the expectations that they set for us.
I don't think we have any HUD reps available to us. I mean, in attending today. There's another question.
Okay.
Some clients put the day they come in to do the intake. Is that okay?
As the date homelessness started?
Oh, I think so. I think that's the question. Yes, that is the question.
If this is the date that their homelessness started, then that would be appropriate. But they definitely wouldn't be chronically homeless in that case. Unless you're looking at the 4 periods of homelessness in 3 years, potentially. So I guess if today is the date that their homelessness started, then that's the appropriate date. If today is not the date, then no, it should be the actual date that homelessness started.
Okay. Do you want me to keep going with the questions
Sure.
here? Okay.
Sure.
So the person who was asking that question says, when questioning them, they will say a longer date, I think a past date. Okay. Which would be appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you'll go into this, but as far as counting or helping the clients count accurately, the breaks in homelessness are if they're on a couch for longer than how many days?
7 days.
7 days. So if they pay for a motel themselves for longer than 7 days, that's a break.
Correct. So the question was whether they, if they pay for a motel, or if they're on a couch or paying for a motel for more than 7 days, is that a break? And the answer is yes.
And if they're in jail over 90 days. So
Right.
if they're in jail for 7 days, it's not a break.
Correct. Right. So long as they were homeless before they were in jail. So the question was, if they were in jail for 7 days, whether that would not count as a break, which is correct, and they would still be considered chronically homeless so long as they were homeless before the jail period.
I have another question here.
Okay.
There's another question there's a couple things coming in from our online audience. So with a client fleeing domestic violence, what date should be used for the date of homelessness?
That's a good question. Kate or Eileen, do you guys know?
I think it would be the day that they.
It's still really, oh, so it is still okay, so it's the date that they left, yeah, the date they were fleeing.
Okay, so the date that they were fleeing. And then the other one is clients do not accrue homelessness time while they are institutionalized, correct? So can you restate the?
Correct. They're sort of out of play at that time. They are, but they don't necessarily lose their chronic homeless status unless they have been institutionalized for longer than 90 days, or if they weren't homeless before they were institutionalized, then they also wouldn't be counted. Is that all?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this is an important piece that I want to be sure to mention. With regard to all of these questions that I just walked you through, if any of them are marked as unknown, or the client refused, or the data is missing, not collected, or it's just field is blank, the client will be determined to not be chronically homeless. And it's not so much that the system is saying that they're not chronically homeless. It's more that the system wants to be sure when it says yes, that they really are chronically homeless. And so if there is any doubt, then they're just considered not. That's how HUD instructs us to set that. So if you are looking at your folks, if you're running your APR and you are seeing that only half the folks are showing up as chronically homeless from who you'd expect, this can often be the reason. If you've got missing fields, then the system cannot make that calculation. The APR specifically tells us to not include those folks. And so, and I can show you how to find those folks later too. Yeah.
I promise I'm not going to raise my hand every 5 seconds. So I would say out of 50 clients, probably 45, when they're asked about their disabling condition, and they, even when they do endorse it, they're asked if it's a long-term condition, they almost never say yes. I don't know if this is a place to bring that up, but like it's definitely, I don't know if it's the wording of the question or it's just something going on with my client population. But they almost never say that it is a long-term condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the question was, or the comment was that clients almost never say that their disabling condition is long-term, even when they identify that they have a disabling condition. And I think in that case, I mean, so of course you don't have to use the language that's on the forms or in HMIS. And, you know, maybe it's better to just start with about when did this start, as opposed to is this long-term, and then, you know, you can make the determination of whether it's long-term or not, you know, rather than leaving it up to them. All right, documented data. Now this is the part of the data collected at HMIS that HUD considers to be third-party documentation for chronic homeless status. HUD considers, with some exceptions, and we'll talk about all of them, enrollments in emergency shelter, street outreach, and safe haven programs to be considered documentation of chronic homelessness, third-party documentation that can be obtained from HMIS. For emergency shelters, if the shelter program is an entry-exit program or long-term program, then the enrollment start and end date are what is used to determine the period of homelessness, and 1 day of enrollment during the month counts the whole month. For night-by-night shelters, only bed nights count. It does not matter what the enrollment dates are for night-by-night shelters. Only bed nights determine when a client is still homeless, and 1 bed night during a month counts a whole month. So if you have an enrollment that is 3 years long, but the client only has 1 bed night during that entire 3 years, which you never would because you are responsibly exiting your shelter clients after 90 days, 30 days of inactivity. But if it just got overlooked by chance, only that 1 month that the bed night showed up in would actually be counted towards homelessness, regardless of how long the enrollment period is. Street outreach is similar. The only some street outreach services count, only outreach contact services, specifically ones where they are indicated as staying on streets, emergency shelter, or safe haven. So you can see I have provided an example of an outreach contact service, and you can tell it's an outreach contact service by at the right there you can see outreach contact. It's only that center option, staying on streets, emergency shelter, or safe haven, having that service for a client that would make them be counted as homeless for that period. And again, just like with everything else, 1 contact during the month counts the whole month towards homelessness. Safe haven is pretty straightforward. That's just like long-term shelters. It's just the enrollment start and end dates, and 1 day of enrollment during the month counts the whole month towards homelessness. So we've gotten a couple questions about the new move-in date field that housing programs are collecting. It used to be just a field for rapid rehousing programs. Now all permanent housing projects identify the move-in date in addition to the enrollment date, because some programs can serve clients before they actually move them into housing. Maybe they're working with them to get document ready. Maybe the unit is not quite ready yet. Whatever the case may be, sometimes a permanent housing project will have a different move-in date from when they're actually enrolled. HUD tells us that the client should still be counted as homeless during that period before they have that move-in date. But so far, they have not given us any specs to actually program that into the system. So for now, as soon as they've got an enrollment date, they're going to be counted as housed by the system determination, not any other determination. But like on the APR, for example, well, actually, that's not a good example, but whatever. Just know that as of yet, if you see inconsistencies around that, it's just because HUD has yet to give us guidance around putting that in place. Getting chronic homeless data out of HMIS. Do we have any questions at this point? No? Oh, all right. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different reports that you can use to pull your chronic homeless information out of HMIS. The first one is the client summary report, and this is the one that I was mentioning. You can access this, you see in the little image, This is accessed through the printer icon on a client's profile page. It is just a client level report, so it only includes information on that client. This report actually uses both that self-reported data, the enrollment data, and their history in HMIS to make a determination about chronic homeless status. So you can see, probably not very well, but I have an example of the report on the side there. It's a test client, so she has no program enrollment, so it's not the best example, but you can see in the highlighted part that she's determined to be not chronically homeless. But you can also see that there are the questions about her disability and housing program enrollment information. Oh boy, you really can't see that at all. But so you'll have to trust me that the information down the side is her disability information and her history of enrollments in housing programs, so that you can see what is leading into that determination. The report also has other pieces of information as well about particularly related to coordinated entry. So it's a useful report overall, but it is one where we specifically specify whether the system determines somebody to be chronically homeless or not. Yeah.
So then if somebody's referring you to a program where the clients are supposed to be HUD certified, disabled, and homeless, then technically they shouldn't be sending any referrals over to you that aren't already marked as chronically homeless?
Well, so what, so you're talking through coordinated entry? Stacey, do you know how they're making that determination around coordinated entry chronic homelessness? Are they using because in the assessments, we collect all of the self-reported fields. Kate's coming to the front of the room
They
here.
wouldn't, so the referrals, they would not be using the data collected through the enrollments.
That's right.
It would just be the assessment.
There's two things. One is it documented in the HMIS? It may be that someone does meet the definition of chronically homeless, but their experience is not recorded in the HMIS. So you might have someone legitimately referred where this would not indicate that. But if it is indicated here, then it should be pretty solid.
Right.
And we do have, on the housing triage tool, there are some disabling condition questions and some living situation questions that are meant to help further capture that information, so that if that is a requirement of that program, then only clients that are answering in the ways that would be a good match would show up for the matchmakers or the referral specialists to make a referral. But again, that's just on whatever is captured by the assessor doing the housing triage tool, the ISPDAP process.
Thank you.
All right. The next place where you can pull, excuse me, chronic homeless information on your clients or for your programs is in the APR. Of course, the APR is a super long report, but question 26 is the chronic homelessness question that talks about how many of your clients are chronically homeless, and then breaks it all down by a number of different demographics so you can learn more about the folks who your program is serving. The APR only looks at that program enrollment data, or sorry, the disability and living situation data that you collect at program enrollment. It does not look at any sort of history in HMIS. So if you run the APR and you've got clients who you know have been in shelter for over a year and it's well documented in the system, if their enrollment into your program doesn't accurately reflect that in the living situation information, they will not show up as chronically homeless on this report. So, but always with all of our reports, you can click on the numbers to get to a list so you can see if folks aren't showing up who should be, or folks are showing up who shouldn't be. And I'll also show you in just a second another way to look at that information. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. And then of course, the one other useful piece about the APR is that you can run it for a specific project or a project type. If you have permanent supportive housing projects and you want to look to make sure that the number of units you have are filled by folks who are identified in the system as being chronically homeless, you can run it for all of your projects, all of your PSH projects at once, or you can run it for your whole agency if you just want to get a sense of who your agency is serving as well. I mean, the APR is really useful. It's such a long report, but it contains a ton of useful stuff if you just want to understand who you're serving. So we recommend it a lot. Then the last report that I wanted to mention is the HUD Data Quality Report. This is a relatively new one that HUD came up with. as a way to help communities identify data quality issues in their data. This Q5 on this report looks at chronic homeless data in particular. It's actually also on the APR. So if you're running the APR, you can just get it from there. You don't need to run this report, but this report also contains a lot of other data quality information. So it's useful in that respect. This table, this Q5 table, specifically shows you who is missing information that causes the system to not be able to make a determination about chronic homelessness. So it can be really useful. I don't know how well you can see, but on the second to last two columns, number of times and number of months, there's a 3 and a 2 in terms of folks who are missing this information. So those are the folks for whom chronic homeless status can't be determined. So if you click on those folks, you can see who they are, go to their records, correct that information, and then they should show up quickly. So this is a way to quickly identify those folks who are causing your numbers to not be counted as they should be.
So you're saying in the reports, if you click on the number, it'll show you.
It'll give you a list of the names, yeah, who make up that number. All right, so now.
The report is a certain type, right? Not as a PDF.
Oh, the web version, yes, the web version of the report,
Oh, no.
which is the default version.
So I don't know if everybody got that for the online audience, that if you run any report with aggregate numbers as a web version and click on the numbers, you'll get a drill down of who's counted in that report.
And so now Danielle's going to walk us through a few client scenarios so we can see some folks who show up as chronically homeless and not. Great. So folks should see our test environment for Clarity Human Services.
Good afternoon. So I created a couple, I'm going to pull up my email because I have my cheat sheet in there. So I created a couple clients to just kind of give an overview of looking at chronic homelessness. And when I created them, I was hungry for pizza. So they are all named something, something pizza. All right, so we're going to start with veggie pizza. And we're just going to look, oops. All right, so this is, I'm going to ask for feedback. Looking at this client, is this client chronically homeless? Based on what you've heard today. I need to scroll down a little bit so you can see some things, but make note of this enrollment date, and this is for emergency shelter. And I was just going to try to zoom out so we could see it all on one page, but okay. Anyone, is this client chronically homeless? Based on the information here, or anyone online?
I'm getting some answers online.
Okay, great.
I'm getting some yeses.
Okay, and can you explain why the answer is yes?
I'm getting some mixed. Somebody's saying, where's the disability? Somebody else is saying no.
Great.
The duration is over a year, but there's no disabling condition.
Correct. The duration is over a year, so they have the time, but they do not have a disabling condition. Therefore, veggie pizza is not chronically homeless. Any questions about that scenario? All right, let's look at, we'll look at cheese pizza next. Okay, so looking at the information for this enrollment, based on the information here, is cheese pizza chronically homeless?
I'm getting a yes online.
Okay.
A few more yeses coming in.
I have a no from the room.
I have a no online as well.
Okay.
Somebody's confused.
Okay. Can someone who said no tell me why the answer is no?
Not enough total number of months. No.
Correct. So the total, they have 4 or more episodes, but the total number of months is not 12 or more months. So Cheese Pizza is not chronically homeless. Even though they have 4 episodes and they have a disabling condition, they have not had 12 months of homelessness in those 4 episodes. Any questions about Cheese Pizza?
Would that have changed if the approximate date they were homeless was something like 2015, 2013?
It could have, yes, because that may have bumped them up to the 12-month span. But based on what was in the system, that client wasn't considered homeless.
I do have a question coming in. I'm trying to determine if it was on veggie or cheese.
Sure.
It might just take a minute.
Sure.
So.
All right. So we'll go on to Chicago and then go back to the question from online. Okay, based on the information you see here for Chicago Pizza, is this person chronically homeless? I hear yeses from the room.
There's a yes online.
Yes online. Can someone tell me why the answer is yes?
Both disabling and the time frame for the homelessness.
Correct. So this client has a disabling condition and they have one consistent period of over 12 months of homelessness. One final one. We are going to move on to barbecue pizza. Now that I've made everyone hungry. Okay, looking at this, noting that the program entry date is 6/1, so I can scroll down so you can see. Looking at this, based on the information here, is barbecue pizza chronically homeless? And it's possible that this is a trick question.
I have a yes online.
Okay.
Can't tell.
Okay.
Somebody's asking 2 times meaning broken by institution, question mark.
No, 2 separate documentable episodes of being with a break in the middle. Any yeses? No? I hear no. Okay, so the answer to this is actually maybe. You would need more information to be able to determine whether or not, based on this information, this counted as chronically homeless. And here's why. And I made myself a note. So they have a current stay of 5 months in a shelter, which was this enrollment date up here. They had less than 90 days in a inpatient situation, which does not count as a break in homelessness. But what you would need to know is how long they were homeless prior to entering to know if it was a year solid. Because even if it doesn't count as a break, if it's not a complete year, it's still not chronically homeless. So that piece that you're missing is how long were they homeless prior to entering the institution? Any questions about barbecue pizza? Stacy, did we have any questions about?
There was, somebody was asking where was barbecue pizza prior to the psychiatric hospital,
Yeah.
or that you may need to know that.
Yes,
and it sounds
correct.
like that's sort of what you were answering.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a question about the first profile. I think that was veggie.
Yes.
The first one was in 2016. Wouldn't that be considered chronic homeless?
So veggie is not chronically homeless because this client does not have a disabling condition. So they have the amount of time, but they don't have the disabling condition piece.
Okay. Yeah.
Great.
There, got it. Thank you.
Question from the room?
I thought if you weren't 12 consecutive months of homelessness, that you had to have at least 4 or more breaks.
Correct. Are you asking about barbecue pizza?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was saying was if that client was homeless, say barbecue pizza was homeless 8 months prior to going into inpatient, was into inpatient less than 90 days, and then has been in emergency shelter for 6 months, that actually counts as longer than a year of homelessness, because that inpatient stay doesn't actually break up the 8 months and the 6 months in the shelter. So it counts as one long period of homelessness.
So just as long as, so if you were shelter hopping, say, going from one shelter to another, then that's continuously homeless.
It is.
Okay.
So if you're going from shelter to shelter, if you're outside a couple days and then in the shelter and then out and in, that still counts as one episode of homelessness. The breaks are 7 days inside in, if you're staying with like friends or family, or you're paying for a hotel, or you get housed, and then 90 days, is it 89 nights or 90 days? Okay, 90 days or more in an inpatient facility. So treatment, so that would count as a break. But for barbecue pizza, because it was less than 90 days in that institution, it doesn't count as a break between those two periods. Question?
I might have missed this correctly.
Sure.
Does jail count if it's less than 90 days? Are they allowed to be jailed?
Jail is considered an institution, so if it's less than 90 days, it doesn't count as a break.
So it doesn't have to be patient.
Correct, sorry. In a facility of some form.
Okay.
And I believe that includes hospitalization, just like medical hospitalization. So if it's less than 90 days, that also does not count as a break. Right.
And it also includes foster care.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
I do have online questions.
Sure.
Is disabling condition self-determined, or are there requirements for that?
It depends on the program in terms of documentation.
Well, for what, in terms of, so I think now we're getting into kind of documenting chronic homelessness for the purpose of program eligibility.
Well, I think it was based on what we were seeing as answered here. If the person says to me, yes, I'm disabled, yes or no, I'm assuming since we were looking at enrollment data.
Yeah, it really is self-reported at this point, yeah.
At this stage that we're looking at with the enrollment.
Right.
And then there's a comment of, and this came in while you were explaining the potential breaks, was, has any client ever remembered all of that?
No.
Right.
Which is why it's one thing that can be really helpful, if I may.
Yeah.
One thing that can be really helpful when you sit down with clients to talk about those breaks is to map it backwards. Okay, where are you staying now? How long have you been there? Okay, where were you before that? Were you inside maybe a week or so at like Christmas time, and use holidays or memorable events as you're going backwards to kind of help fill in that, especially when you're talking episodes, to help kind of fill in that. So you stayed in a hotel, great. Was it 3 days? Was it over a week? And just kind of working backwards tends to help track that time.
Right. There's a comment that they still may not remember, which,
correct,
of course.
Correct. Okay. Anything else? Awesome.
Thank you, Danielle.
Danielle has only been working with us for about a week and a half now, so great job,
We are
Danielle.
happy to have her on board.
Yeah.
This is Kate, just in listening to our language here, when we're saying they are chronically homeless or are not, as we can see it in the HMIS, just reminding ourselves that what we're talking about here is our ability to see and demonstrate it in the HMIS. If it's in the HMIS, then it's fairly clean and clear. If it's not, it doesn't mean they aren't chronically homeless. It just means we can't track it here.
Thanks, Kate.
Right.
And I have a question that's come in.
Yeah.
For clients who are not linked with a homeless program or outreach service, for example, if they are in their car or in a tent, how can they document periods of homelessness? I believe the self-declaration limit is, or self-doc limit is 3 months, ?
That is a great segue into our next section, which is documenting chronic homelessness,
Perfect.
which Eileen is going to take for us. Yeah. It's just, yes, by all means.
As long as you project. Can you remind everybody who you are?
So this is Eileen Denham. I work for the City of Seattle Human Services Department.
And she can project her voice.
And I'm going to try and talk louder so that you can all hear me out there. I work with a lot of agencies who are dedicated to serving chronically homeless. And I work with them on meeting HUD's record-keeping requirements. Because while you're talking about data going into HMIS, they're looking at the data coming out of HMIS because they have a role to play in making sure that if I come out to monitor or if HUD comes out to monitor, that they have the appropriate records in place to verify that in fact these individuals meet HUD's definition of chronic homelessness. And actually that's required in a HUD circular. So every agency, every program that is dedicated to serving chronically homeless has to have written intake procedures that lays out the process for documenting chronic homelessness. And one of the first things that you have to do is to prioritize that documentation. So your intake procedures lay out what is the first order of priority, what is the first type of documentation you need to secure to verify homelessness. That is HMIS. So we're having a good conversation about what goes in is really helpful to agencies when they have to pull it out. So if someone is documented, if you can go in and document episodes of homelessness in HMIS and you look at it and there's 12 months, you're golden. They have met the duration requirements for chronic homelessness. That's assuming that someone else is also working with them to secure the disability documentation. So we're talking a little bit about how difficult it is to get them to kind of answer the questions when you're going through the intake procedure. But when I come out to monitor them, I'm actually going to want to see that documentation in the file. And that needs to be written documentation from a state certified professional charged with making this determination. So it's going to be a chemical dependency counselor, it's going to be an MD, it's going to be a mental health therapist that will document that they have a disability of long-standing duration that affects their ability to function. The other kind of third-party documentations you're going to be looking at, say you go into HMIS, again, we saw all these different scenarios. It's not clear whether or not you can document either the full 12 months just based on HMIS, but you see that they were staying at a CCS shelter or a DESC shelter. You can also use actual letters from DESC or CCS saying, this individual has been staying at my shelter since 2001 and is ready to move into permanent supportive housing. I've known him this long, blah, blah, blah. Again, golden, you've met your 12-month standard. Where it starts to get tricky is you will find that chronicity and homelessness is a very fluid proposition. Nobody is going to be able to come in and give you this, here's my report card, I have everything in my little envelope. You're going to have to do some investigating. You're going to have to create a story, and you're going to have to know where to look to find the elements of that story. Some of it is good interviewing techniques. Some of it is just, you know this client. You have an outreach program connected to your agency who may be familiar with this client. The next order of documentation in the priority listing then would be observations of the intake worker, observations of the outreach worker. So again, the individual that you know has been homeless on the street, he says, well, I don't know where I was staying. I think I was staying here. Few more questions, you find out that they've been connected to REACH. You're going to be reaching out to that outreach worker. Then HUD is expecting not only that evidence that you made that phone call that he said that he was out on the street. When I go out to monitor, I'm going to want to see something from that outreach worker that describes, I've known this individual again since 2010. I've seen him on this corner at least monthly for the last 12 months. I've tried to engage him. I've tried to connect him with services. It hasn't worked. It's wonderful that he's, rising to the list and he should be in permanent supportive housing. That individual has documented for you 12 months of homelessness. Again, it's one time, 1 month for 12 months. The key is that outreach worker needs to be able to kind of, again, create the story. Where have they been homeless? And what they know about that client.
And I would just add, on letterhead.
Oh, thank you.
Dated. Signed.
I haven't gotten to that page yet.
I have a question.
Oh, yes, question?
If you're ready for
Sure.
a question. So if a client who has been in our program for over a year, who did not identify as disabled, but who obviously is, and has shared his or her story of struggling with that disability, should we be updating Clarity, HMIS, to reflect their disability?
Certainly you might want to do that if you can do that, but for purposes of HUD's record keeping requirement, we will have to have that third-party verification of the disability.
Outside of HMIS?
Outside of HMIS.
Okay.
Yes.
What if the worker had 11 months documented and the person has been out there for 12 months? Then what do we do?
We're going to get to that, right?
Okay.
So HUD also, in its vast wisdom, again, realizes that documenting chronicity is not easy. Again, people don't always know where they were. You can maybe go in, again, and find that they stayed in shelter, they've been on the street, but you can't necessarily trail it back with written documentation. They have allowed for some self-certification. So if you can document 9 months of homelessness, 3 months can be self-certified. But what I want to make clear about that self-certification is it's not this created form where they just sign, which certainly you can do. There needs to be backup to that from the intake worker, from perhaps the outreach worker, somebody who has been engaged with that individual that can attest to somewhat the framework of what he's telling you, that he's been homeless. The other thing that's nice to know is that self-certification can also be used to document breaks. So you've got an individual, you went in and you looked at your HMIS, you can't just easily say, oh wow, here's 12 months, he's golden, I'm gonna have to create this story, and you can begin to piece together the parts. He can self-certify to those breaks. Again, having something in the file to sort of back up where he was during those break periods. But you can certify to the, you can use self-certification for the 7-day breaks.
So you don't need backup documentation for the HMIS record?
If an agency, maybe not your agency, but another agency has been dutifully putting their records in HMIS, and you can go in there and see that they were in a shelter, they've been staying at a shelter for 12 months, you can print that out, put it in the client file, that's your documentation. The intake worker will have to secure the disability documentation. You'll need to make sure that he was homeless on the street, blah, blah, blah. But that's all you need to do is print out that HMIS documentation. Where it begins to get tricky.
There's just one thing I want to say with reference to that prioritization. We can't begin to think, oh, I only need to document 9 months. I can always do 3 self-certification, because HUD, if they're reviewing, and many of you do have HUD funding in some of your programs, it really is a prioritization. So if you can do 12 months, they want to see 12 months. If you are doing 3 months of client self-certification, they're going to want some indication of why you weren't able to get more third-party documentation. documentation. So we should always, understanding all the complexities that you all work with every day, still know that if we're not using third party, we should have an indication of why not before we're using self-certification.
That's right. So it would be, for the record, when I come to look at the client file, I'm going to want to see the steps that you took to secure that third-party documentation, no matter what it is. I can tell you, if someone were to go out and monitor the program and you find out that all of your records only have 9 months of documentation because you're allowing them to self-cert for 3 months, it's not going to work. It has to be clear that that was an individualized determination.
So I have a number of comments here. So I want to, before we get too far away from this topic. So there is a question, isn't there a threshold of 5% self-certification per agency?
So one of the things that I can talk about on self-certification, again, in HUD's wisdom, knowing the fluidity of individuals who are chronically homeless, a long time on the street, those that really cannot adequately describe their housing situation. They've been living out in the woods for the last 3 years because they're afraid to come in. That's a scenario I'm going to just throw out there. You can use self-certification for 100% of the time. It's very rare. It's highly selective. You should be very careful in doing that. There has to be very clear backup in the file why you are doing that, what your interview has told you and led you to make that decision. They do allow it. No more than 25% of your overall records can be 100% self-cert. I think that's probably what they were talking about.
I think so.
Again, I want to caution you, that's highly selective. Should be only used on the most rare and high need circumstances.
So one of our online folks, I would contend that thinking that there is always an outreach worker to add backup to client self-certification is just not a realistic expectation. And then there's a question from a different person. Does all this mean that if someone living outside who hasn't been observed by an outreach worker and never stayed in shelter, maybe because CEA is the first time, Coordinated Entry for All, is the first time they've engaged in services, that person's date of homelessness can't be verified and they lose their actual date of homelessness?
So this is where if HMIS could step in, because I don't really know about what data you actually put into HMIS. I can talk about what the record should show. And there certainly are going to be individuals like that. And it really falls to the intake worker and the individual who identified that individual and engaged him with CEA to create the scenario, the background story. And this, again, might be the individual that would be part of that 100% self-cert. But again, the file is going to have to show what leads you to believe that he really was hiding in the woods for the last 12 months, how did he become engaged with Coordinated Entry. There probably is a trail that you can walk backwards from, but that we would want to see that history, so to speak, in the file.
And I'll just reiterate for our online folks that we will be sending out this presentation as a recording and the slides, and we will make sure that your questions get answered if we're not getting to the meat of it right now. It can be hard when you can't go back and forth with the presenter,
right?
But I think we've gotten them.
And I'm trying to keep it at sort of a higher level instead of just going down into the woods.
The one thing that I would add is sometimes our first inclination is, have they been in shelters? Have they had outreach workers? But depending on your community and your location, sometimes food banks can be great. Like they know somebody who has come out of this tent community on a regular basis for a period of time and only taken food that you don't need to cook. Or so there can be other kind of ways of helping to, depending upon the size of your community, where you are throughout the county. I know that's been used successfully. Yeah. Sometimes there are collaborative, supportive police officers in certain communities that have worked with someone for quite some time. And I'm speaking from, like files I've reviewed, so I know
Yeah.
these are the sorts of things that,
Right.
that can be used.
Hospital social workers, so a minister, a church in the neighborhood that has seen him, any of those will work. But again, there needs to be something in that file that sort of verifies or documents your efforts to secure that information, but your efforts also to make sure that the story is real and is in the client file.
That's the last one. That was
Okay.
good.
So my advice is the first thing you're going to do, the intake worker is going to look in HMIS. That is the easiest place to go, first of all, to look to see what their homeless history is. And does it support 12 continuous months? If it does, then you're done. If it doesn't, you need to look to other avenues to support their duration of homelessness. Again, if you aren't able to kind of piece that 12 months together, then you need to start looking at episodes of homelessness. You want to look in HMIS. Does it support the 12 cumulative months? And that is those episodes of homelessness that might be broken up by moving in with mom or the girlfriend or moving out of state and then coming back in. Again, you want to look at the hierarchy of documentation. If you can't find that documentation from third-party sources, then you're going to go down the hierarchy to find that documentation. Again, it takes some creativity in working with the client to do that. Yes?
When you say the intake worker, do you mean someone after they've moved in?
No, I mean, who's ever kind of engaging with him to develop the documentation, to secure the documentation.
So ideally, by the time they're offered housing, they would already have everything documented and ready to go.
Yes, yes.
Can you repeat the question? So the question was,
Yeah.
what did Eileen mean by intake worker?
Oh, right.
It's more kind of a time frame thing I was wondering. 'Cause
Yeah. So this is all going to be before they move in. So you need to determine their chronicity, their homeless and duration of homeless status before they move in. One thing I can say, a lot of responsibility falls to the intake worker, is based on again, because they need all these other tests and you want to get them housed, and the intake worker or the person that's doing the application, skilled person, observes a disability, observes issues with capacity, knows that they may be engaged with maybe a mental health provider, or knows that they can probably have an evaluation done. You have 45 days from move-in to secure that disability documentation. I don't see that often. I don't see that often where programs will move someone in without the disability documentation, but the rule does provide for that.
And I do think that's important to remember, because I know you all are trying to get people into the housing as quickly as possible. So if there's a clear disability and you're just having trouble getting through to the Social Security office, because we know how delays happen there, or other things, but otherwise it's clear, remember that you can move them in and there's 45 days. I think that's important for all of us.
Yeah. HUD has issued some guidance on how to define and chronic homelessness. It's issued guidance on the record keeping requirements for chronic homelessness. It's even issued some kind of file content materials that you can use. So one of the things we're talking about is you do that initial assessment when you're looking at the duration of homelessness to see whether or not, number one, they meet that test for 12 months. If you find that they don't, then what you're going to want to do is create that chronology. So we talked about that. The best that you can, you say, okay, you you weren't homeless for 12 months consecutively, but let's go through your history. And on a form, you begin to write down those dates. They were here between roughly this date and that date, and they were here roughly between this date and that date. And you begin to see a picture form, and then you know, you can kind of gauge that that's a break, that's a period of homelessness. This looks like the documentation that I'm going to have to secure to fill out my file. I was going to go somewhere with that. But it's also something that we look for when we come to monitor you. But it gives you that picture. And then you absolutely know kind of the gaps that you need to fill in. And let me give you one other piece of advice that I see when I go out to monitor. Once you have those 3 episodes, those 3 breaks, once you have the 12 months, don't go any farther. You want to make sure that your documentation in the file doesn't conflict, so that you say that he was homeless here, but then I have information in the file that says he wasn't, but you don't even really need to have that information in the file because it was 18 months ago or 24 months ago, and I'm only looking at this 18-month period. I mean, this is kind of off the record, but once you have it, there's no need to go back necessarily 3 years. You're going to go back 3 years if you have to, but only go back far enough to actually meet the test is my advice. HUD would give you that advice too, by the way. In one of HUD's slides, I have to say, document occasions of homelessness with the best evidence you can find. Document your attempts to secure evidence of breaks, plus any oral statements when you cannot get the best evidence. Make sure that goes in your file.
We have no questions online right now. Right. Oh, can a client's family offer verifying statements? Somebody from the audience said on letterhead.
I know. Interesting. I haven't had that one. I think it would have to be something, again, that would be supported by other evidence. It might be a little close to home, but I wouldn't want to absolutely say no, because I think you want to look at the context of all of the information that you've collected.
Great. Thank you, Eileen.
All right. So much documentation that Eileen was talking about. It can be hard to keep track of. If you would like, you can store your documentation in HMIS so that it's all centrally available and easily accessible by those who need to access enrollment, if you go under the program section and then edited enrollment to go inside, that program enrollment, then you'll see an additional files section that you can upload documentation that is only available to your agency. Other folks will not be able to see any documentation that you upload there. So if in doubt, if you're not sure, that's a great place. If you're uploading things like, a copy of ID, which I know is something that people upload quite often since it can be so easy to lose, and it's great to have that backup. That's one that maybe it's not a problem to upload to that highest level for anyone to use it, since other folks are working with the client. But if in doubt, you can lock it down to just your agency.
Sarah, I'm sorry. We lost sound for the online audience at the moment that you were talking about the ROI and consent. So can you just repeat that one more time? So the question about whether that covered the documents that were being uploaded, that's what they missed.
No, there is not additional consent required for Kate. It should be fine for you to upload documentation in support of somebody getting housing. But if in doubt, upload it at the client level, or at the program enrollment level, so that it's only available to your agency.
Thank you.
And again, I just want to mention that this top level, also this documentation would be available to coordinated entry staff, which can be useful in terms of the work that they're doing to try to find housing for clients. I think this is the last thing that I'm going to talk about, which is new tools that we have coming soon that will hopefully help greatly, both directly and indirectly, with regard to capturing documenting chronic homelessness information using HMIS. So the first thing that we are currently working on developing is a homeless verification report. This is actually going to be, it's very exciting. Everyone is excited about it. We have been working with providers to talk about what would be useful to have in it. We started out with this idea that's been totally scrapped, and now we are at a new idea, and maybe that one will be totally scrapped too, but it's kind of an iterative process as we figure out what's going to make the most sense. At this point, we're talking about 2 reports. The first one is a graphical layout of client enrollments on a timeline. So you'll be able to see all at once on just a client by client basis, what a client's enrollments have been, what kinds of programs they've been enrolled in, where the gaps are, where the overlap is. You'll just have that picture that's a lot easier to digest than a bunch of date ranges that can be so hard to imagine. So that'll be kind of the high level piece. And then there'll be a second part that is just a spreadsheet that will include all of that enrollment information, but will also include the self-reported information as well as exit information. So you'll be able to see their enrollment, their program type, their enrollment dates, when they've got services, but you'll also be able to see other pieces that may help you figure out this puzzle, like to see that they came from, this kind of situation, this kind of living situation for this amount of time. So it can give you clues of, of where to look to find more information to build that case for documenting chronic homelessness. And it will give you their exit destination information as well. So you can see whether it appears that they exited to a homeless situation, even though it may not be documented in HMIS. It at least will give you a clue of where else you might be able to look. So the hope was that creating these reports would give folks more information altogether at once in a handy format, and as many clues from the system as we could that might help you figure out the rest of the picture for a client. The other 2 pieces are indirect supports of documenting chronic homelessness in HMIS. Early next year, we're going to be rolling out scan cards for emergency shelters, day centers, and outreach programs who are interested in participating. Scan cards allow high volume settings to more easily locate clients and document their services in HMIS. And since for some of these programs, like emergency shelters, night-by-night emergency shelters, and street outreach projects, since those services are the documentation piece in HMIS, this will hopefully increase data quality around just getting that data into HMIS so that it can be used to document homelessness. So that's pretty exciting. And then the last piece is electronic ROI signatures. Wouldn't that be amazing? So King County has been working with the Department of Commerce to get approval for that. It's something that our HMIS can do, but we do not use it in King County. So we're pretty close. We're still working with them on it, but we're pretty close to getting approval. Once that happens, clients will be able to sign their ROIs directly within HMIS, rather than you having to give them a paper form to sign, scan it in, upload it, that lengthy process. This way they'll be able to sign directly using a touchscreen if you're having them access HMIS on a tablet, or you can have them sign with a mouse. So as long as they're in front of a computer or a mobile device, appropriate mobile device, they'll be able to much more easily sign that information, which means that we're just going to have better data quality overall in terms of being able to identify these clients and know for sure that the information that we have is tied to the right client. So that's pretty exciting. We're excited. And that's all. We just have about 4 minutes to spare here. And I know we've answered a lot of questions along the way, but if there are other questions that folks have that we can answer.
Are there other questions in the room? Is there anybody else online who has any final questions? Not seeing anything come through.
Okay.
Just kind of a sidebar question about the scan cards. I didn't know that was a go. Do you have a sense of how many agencies or shelters are willing to participate in that?
I don't think we have a sense of that yet. I mean, it's voluntary, so folks don't have to join in then. That's when we're going to be kind of training folks and offering more support around rolling it out. But folks will be able to join in at later times if they're not quite ready. We're certainly encouraging night-by-night shelters and outreach programs and day centers to participate since it's way easier. Randall has been piloting scan cards with Compass and has only rave reviews. So
I think the last count from the spreadsheet that Dusty sent out for people to sign up for hardware, there's probably 7 or 8.
And that's just city-funded programs. So there may be additional programs that don't receive city funding who are interested in participating. So. Okay.
There is a question about whether scan cards are going to be required eventually. Which...
I think that's unknown at this point. Yeah.
And then there's another question about, and I know somebody else has also said that they were typing one, so I have a couple questions here. About the ROI, can we use DocuSign and then upload the printed document for the ROI? And I'm looking to you because that's sort of in between the electronic versus scanned hand signature.
That's a little beyond certainly beyond the HMIS scope. That's about how you get the signatures, regardless of how it gets into HMIS.
Right.
So I'm not sure if we have any policies around using electronically signing the ROI and then, treating it just like a physical ROI that gets uploaded. No.
Well, we can, it doesn't sound, Veronica, I don't think we'll have an answer right now, but we are continuing to refine that ROI FAQ that we have on the HMIS website. And so that may be a question that we can add and then get an answer for. Sure. There's another question. We moved quickly over the questions of disabling conditions. Clients are often confused by the substance abuse question. If they are identifying as an addict but have been sober for a long time and connected with services. So is there, so the question is around somebody's disabling condition around substance abuse if they have been clean and sober for a long time.
Well, this is the part about a disabling condition that is having impact on their ability to maintain their own housing. So there's the crux of the matter. There is someone who is a substance abuse counselor who can speak to why, perhaps after years of sobriety, they would still think that the person can't otherwise maintain housing. I think that's
right. So if you couldn't hear Kate's answer, she spoke to needing verification or support from somebody like a substance abuse counselor who could speak to whether this person who has been sober for this amount of time is unable to maintain housing, and that it then warrants it being counted as a disabling condition.
Are we supposed to be uploading the consent form to HMIS?
Yeah, if clients are, if you're serving new clients or clients who don't have documented consent in HMIS, you should be having them sign the consent form and then scanning it and uploading it into HMIS. Yeah. Right, unless they don't consent.
Unless
right.
they are, yeah, unless they need to be de-identified, in which case they're not consenting to have their information in there.
Right. And in that case, you would still need to indicate in HMIS that they are not consenting, because there is a consent record that says either way.
So that's in the higher level of the file, right? Not our agency.
Right. It's the
Correct.
little shield icon that's near the printer icon.
On the client profile page.
Right. We can show you after if you're. If
Yeah,
you're
we can show you. There's, for anybody who's in, yeah, there's a, the ROI form and the procedure and the FAQ is on the King County HMIS website. I'm mostly telling folks, but we can show you afterwards.
So we're past time, but we did want to, so we always end by showing you our upcoming trainings, which we only have office hours through the rest of the end of the year. There are 3 more sessions. We are, and of course, if you or your staff have not signed up for office hours, we strongly recommend it. It's a great way to get answers to your more detailed questions that you have, or to have us show you how to do something in HMIS. If folks don't have questions, we cover kind of common issues that come up that we know about. So we publicize those and are always excited to have folks sign up and, are happy to talk about any HMIS related topics. So we have 3 sessions of those, which I'll show in just a second. And then we also are currently planning our 2018 training calendar. We tend to offer trainings about once every other month. So about 6 per year that are topic specific like this, chronic homelessness. We did data quality. We did a night-by-night shelter training because of the specific service tracking stuff required for those programs. And so if you have requests for what kind of trainings you would like to see in 2018, please let us know, because we are working on our calendar now and would certainly want to make sure that our trainings are the ones that you want to attend.
I know we are wrapping up, but this is a question that somebody asked right as we were having the sound problems, and so it kind of got lost in the shuffle. And the question is, are CEA assessors, the coordinated entry assessors, expected to be collecting documentation of chronic homelessness? If so, that sort of seems to fly in the face of the assessment being self-reported. And none of the CEA trainings that I've attended or helped co-host has indicated that the assessors are responsible. That is correct. That would fly in the face of their role of doing the self-reported housing triage tool. So I'm looking around to see if anybody has, nope, okay, we've got head nods. And then there is, somebody's asking here where the recording will be uploaded. So we'll be sending out a link to the recording in the newsletter that we send out. We send out a monthly newsletter, so that'll go out this week or the beginning of next week. And we always send out the recording to anybody who's registered for the training, so you could get it that way as well. I just want to make sure I didn't lose anybody. For the folks who didn't hear, Sarah is soliciting training topics. So before you sign off, if you're in our online audience, please feel free to give us your ideas or needs or topics for next year's training schedule, and we're happy to put that into the mix.
And I think that's it. So thank you all for coming.